Welcome back to Go Figure Customs YouTube channel, and welcome back to the Painting 101 tutorial. This is the 5th installment. This one I kind of forgot time lapse was a thing, so the first part of this video is actually kind of redundant. I actually cut 10 minutes of me just painting out, just because it was very boring and you don't need to see me paint something. So it's kind of, might be a little choppy, but I didn't cut out any like tips or tricks that I pass on. So the first half of the video is kind of boring. I know the last video seemed like I was kind of losing interest in this. It's just, some of this painting is just kind of monotonous. And there's not much that I can do to make that interesting. However, once you get past the first half of this video, then we start getting into finishing up this figure because it is almost done. So let's get to it. I'm also going to do the knee pads the same color as the helmet. That base coat should hopefully be dry, and it didn't quite cover it. So just a quick light base coat on top of the first base coat to get that. Headphones under there, like I said, we're going to do those in black to make them stand out from the balaclava. Do the knee pads in that green too. These knee pads have a nice sculpt to them, that you could do them like a stripe in the middle, so you could do two different colors and it would look really nice. But I'm just going to do one solid color on this. Alright, so there's the base coat on the helmet and the knee pads done. So we're going to let that dry a minute, then we're going to do a wash on that. Still going to use that same camo wash. I use that camo wash on all these colors. Even though this is a darker color, that wash will still work with this. If it's not enough, I'll use a black wash on top of it, but I don't think I'll need to. We'll see how well it works. Actually, real quick before we stop, we're going to do the black on the boots, and again, we're using Tamiya Sea Blue. Tamiya can be is not everybody's favorite paint. It can be kind of difficult to use. It needs to be stirred, not shaken. And I usually I'm going to use a small brush on this, and I usually thin it out a little bit with water. So I get a dab out on a palette, and I thin it down a little bit with some water. It's a pain in the ass using two different pairs of glasses. The Tamiya paint, if you get it too thin, you just start moving it around, and if you keep painting at it, it just makes a mess. You need to let it dry and then go back over it with the second coat. So I mean, this isn't, sometimes Tamiya is not the easiest paint to use, but they have a lot of fantastic colors that are not available in other lines. And it also runs through an airbrush really well, which I like. Not normally. I was going to say, for the base coat on this, one of the things I probably would have done to get the green down is airbrushed it on. Would have taken 2 minutes instead of half an hour it took to paint it. This is, a lot of times I will not do the bottom of the boots, but I'll usually get around the edges. Brushes, this is 20, and sometimes at 20 it just doesn't seem like it's small enough. So we'll do the balaclava while I'm out here because I'm going to use the same color. And we get a helmet strap on there too, sculpted on there. I'll have to do that in the green, I think, to make it stand out against the balaclava. You notice the strap on the other side. It's odd. You have to look at their figures and see how they have it painted sometimes. That's kind of one of the downsides to using primer, is you lose painting landmarks on the original, so you're not quite sure how something was painted to begin with, so it's always handy to have a decent picture of the figure before you start, so you know what is painted where. And might as well do the gloves too. So clean out the brush a little bit. And yeah, sometimes a 20-0 brush is just not small enough. There's been times where I've painted an entire custom with a 20-0 brush, base coat and all. It takes a while, but it's on the boots. Brown. That tan needs to, or that black needs to dry first. Alright, so there's the boots and the gloves done with the black. That needs to set somewhere so it can dry. And then the head with balaclava is painted now too. Sorry, the video is not that good to show that fine detail, but it'll do to start. Alright, so next, what's next? I should probably done the strap on the goggles on the helmet in that black. In the meantime, worked a little bit more off the video, painted the strap on the back of the helmet, and I did the magazines on his vest. I touched up his boots a little bit. I'm going to do another wash to blend another sepia wash to blend the brown in a bit better. I also painted the magazines on his thigh rig. Touched up a couple of spots here and there. Needed to touch up a couple of spots on his gloves. I'm going to add a little bit of paint wash to that here as well. Got the knee pads painted. I tried the green wash and it's not dark enough for me, so I'm going to use a black wash, and I'll go over that in a minute. I'll probably end up using that on the helmet then too, because I want the helmet and the knee pads basically the same color and texture. So let's touch up the wash, sepia wash on the boots and the gloves. I think at this point, the minor stuff like this, I'm just gonna stop the video and then pick it back up when I start doing something new.
because you don't need to see me slapping paint on the figure when we've gone over this a bunch of times already. Alright, in an effort to save time, because I'm sure this video is going to be very long at this point, I'm only going to point out things that I've added to it. I'm only going to do live painting now at this point if I'm doing a new technique. So what I've done here is I've painted the inside of the goggles a slightly different green from the helmet, and then I'm going to do a wash over that to make it look like the I'm going to use a kind of mix of a black and a green wash to make it look like there's transparent lenses and you're seeing the color of the helmet through the goggles. The sleeves, the rolled up sleeves, I've painted in a very light green, because if you roll up the sleeves on your shirt, you'll notice the inside of the fabric of your shirt is a lighter color than the outside, and it does really kind of stand out there. So to blend it in, I'm going to do use a wash. I'm going to use that green wash that we've been using the whole time, and then I'm going to do a black wash on the helmet here in a minute. I just have to go get it from my painting supplies, and black wash on the knee pads too. And then we'll pick it back up when there's something new.
All right, we're nearing the end of this project. So far, we've talked about base coats with a medium coat, with a medium paint, washing with a dark one, and then we did the two-tone dry brush, and we did that for the green, for his kind of his flight suit, and then we did the boots and the body armor in the tan. We did the CPO wash, and then we did a dry brush with a lighter color over that. So now I've started doing the detail work, which is kind of the final step. So I've said that my painting system is a 3-step process. It's kind of actually, when you look at the bigger picture, it's actually a 5-step process. So we start off with primering, and then we do a base coat in a medium, and then we do a wash in a darker, and then we do a lighter dry brush, and then we do detail work. What is involved in detail work? Well, as you can see, what remains yet to be painted on this is the skin and the eyes and some of the gear on his vest. So these are the last things that need to be finished on this particular figure. Will he stand there? No, he's too close for that. So these are the last things, and part of the strap on his helmet. Normally I probably would have done that in black, but the black will I'll lose the strap in the balaclava, so I'm going to do that in the same shade of green that his helmet is in. It's one of the things that you got to kind of take into consideration when you're painting your figures, when you're deciding on what colors to use. A lot, especially with the nicely sculpted figures, you don't want to lose that sculpt by just painting it all one color. That's definitely some of the problems that you see on some of Hasbro's figures. Some of those G.I. Joes have fantastic sculpts, but it's just all lost because they've just done it in one color. Doing it in multiple colors costs money, which increases the price, so they don't do that. But that's what customizing is for, is to bring out the details that are there. So next is the skin. And I mentioned probably in the first video how much I detest painting skin. There's 2 ways to paint skin, and that is straight out of the bottle or mixing paint together. There's advantages and disadvantages to both of those. The advantages of painting straight out of the bottle is pretty self-explanatory in the fact that you're just using one shade of paint for all of the skin. The disadvantages are skin, like everything else, is not one shade. So that's why I will still usually follow my same painting technique, painting system. When I do skin, I'll do a medium on the skin, and I'll try and do a wash. A lot of times the washes will get kind of cloudy and a little too dark, so sometimes you have to thin out the washes even more than what they already are, or I'll use a different shade of, I'll take some of the paint that I'm using and add a little white, or I'll mix it with, not white, I'll mix it with the skin toned wash to help blend, to get more, to get the paint a lighter, a darker shade, but to the point where it's not so crusty. It's kind of hard to describe, but the skin tone wash that I have tends to make things, it has the results are not to my liking. So what I'll do is I'll thin out what I'm using and make it just slightly darker, and use that as the wash instead. And then for the dry brushing, I'll add a little white to make it lighter, and then use that as the dry brushing on the skin. The pros of mixing the skin, is that you can add and subtract colors like red and yellow, to get different skin tones, for the same person. So, like I said, skin is different color even on the same person, so you can add different shades of things to get different tones, all at the same time, which is nice. The biggest disadvantage is making sure that you mix enough colors, mix enough paint to paint all of the skin. That's definitely one of the problems that I've had over the years, is either not mixing enough paint, so because it's really hard to go back and get that exact same shade once again mixing paint, or it will dry out. If it's not enough I haven't mixed enough to where it stays wet, where it's thin enough that it starts to air dry, then my paint will dry out before I'm done. So those are definitely huge disadvantages of mixing paint. I think I'd like to say most of the customizers do this, that I know do this or do that, but I don't know. I know one of my buddies swears by mixing paint and will refuse to paint out of a bottle, and I think he does that pretty much like on every color. He won't paint straight out of the bottle. Whereas another one of my buddies will just paint straight out of the bottle. And there's nothing wrong with either. It's, for starters, I'm going to say paint straight out of the bottle. There are millions, no, not millions. There's a lot of choices in paint, skin tone paints, as far as manufacturers. I tend to experiment to find different brands to see which ones I like. Again, the big trick here that's you've got to be careful with is not to get your paint too thick. That can be a pitfall when you're trying to paint skin, because it will seem that you're not covering your paint. You can still see primer under it, so then you get frustrated and you lay on another coat and you can still see the primer under the skin, so you start putting on more and more and more until eventually it's caked over. The trick to avoiding that is painting one layer, even if you can still see the primer under it, and let it dry, and then doing another coat. Multiple thin coats will eventually cover the primer and will not end up having that melted crayon effect. That's something that takes patience, something I'm not particularly good at a lot of times, Also, one of the reasons that I like to have more than one project running at a time, because then I'm not focused in on this particular figure. I can say, okay, I need to let the skin dry. I am going to go work on this other figure while the paint dries. I'll get this particular piece painted, and by the time I'm done doing this, I can go back and do my next layer of skin tone. What we're going to do here for this particular figure is we are going to paint straight out of the bottle. I recently got a brand called, it says the Army Painter War Paints, and I think the brand is just Army Painter. And as I understand it, if I remember correctly, they are a bunch of guys that used to work for Citadel Paints, which is the primary paint that I like to use, that kind of started their own stuff, started their own business. I'm not sure if that's correct, but that's just kind of the rumor that I've heard. That is also, I mentioned at the beginning of the video, primer. Their primer was recommended to me. I'm still finishing up the can of Tamiya primer that I have, but I will be trying their primer next. I really do like the results that I've gotten with the Tamiya primer. I'm beginning to like them more than what I got with the Armory primer, so I'm happy with that. But I did tell myself that I was going to experiment with other primers and find the best one for what I wanted. So as soon as I'm out of the Armory primer, or not the Armory primer, I'm out of that a long time ago. As soon as I'm out of the Tamiya primer, I'm going to try the Army Painters primer and see how that stacks up to the Tamiya primer. So the paint that I'm going to use is Kaibolt Skin. This come in a dropper. I'm not a big fan of the dropper either. I like I said, I like paint from the bottle. So what my technique for that is, these are proprietary. So normally what I do is I put them on a figure stand. This is a custom. I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with this guy. Probably going to be my next Range Viper, but I don't know yet. I haven't decided. But what I'll do is I'll put them on a figure stand, and then I'll put the paint here, and then I'll work off of that. So we're going to do pretty much the same thing. So it's basically a palette. We're going to get us a happy little palette here. And I use one that I've... so a lot of times when I primer my figures, I'll put them on... it's easier with the Joy Toy figures because I can break them down into pieces. But like a G.I. Joe figure or Star Wars figure, they're a lot harder to disassemble and reassemble. So I'll usually assemble the whole figure and then primer it. And I'll do that by putting them on a figure stand and then using my hemostats and then primer it like this. If they're on that figure stand real well, that's fantastic. If the foot peg hole's a little loose, they'll fall off and they'll fall on the ground and they'll get dog hair in the primer. And then you pick it up and you get fingerprints. Yeah, it's a pain in the ass, but it's worth it in the end. So I am going to use, but I am using one that already has primer on it, because I find that it works well as a palette to use something that's already primered. And I think I primered this this is an old stand, and I primered it with what I used for using for my first primer, which was gosh, I can't remember the name. It's a popular Krylon. It was Krylon Engine Primer. And I used that for years and years and years, and didn't have any problems with it until I started getting bad batches. And then eventually I was working on a custom vehicle. I was took a Cobra Bug and I gutted it, and I built an interior for it that would hold figures. It was like a command center in there. I put tons of work. I scratch built it. It was my first like scratch built interior. I was really happy with it. I was like, okay, it's time to paint it. So I primered it, and it was so grainy. It ruined the project. I was so pissed. I'm still pissed to this day. So I stopped using that engine primer. One of my customizing buddies uses a self-etching primer, which means it will eat into the plastic, and I think that's a fantastic idea because then it won't chip off, but I haven't tried that one myself yet. So taking a brush, what am I using here? It's probably a 0. It's a 10/0. 10/0, so a smaller brush than a 0 for the base coat. I get a little bit of water in there to thin it out because we want light, thin coats. Get this gun there for a minute. And then we're just going to do light, thin coats. And we're just going to brush it on. Unlike the base coat where I'm not concerned about coloring inside the lines, I am a little more careful when I do this because I am getting pretty close to the end, and I don't want to have to touch up stuff if I don't want to. Okay, now we're starting to get into that problem of, it's hard to see, but the paint is not fully covering the primer, and that's okay, because what we're going to do is get it to cover as much as it can, as it will, and then we're just going to let it dry, and we're going to do a second coat. Again, the advantage to this is the skin tones will match. That's one of the things about either mixing enough paint, because if you mix just enough paint to do your head and you didn't mix enough to do your arms or any other exposed skin, suddenly your skin tones might not match, and that can be very noticeable if you can't match it exactly again. So painting from the bottle does have its advantages. My biggest disadvantage to this point of painting from a bottle is I've not found a skin tone that I've liked. The one time that I absolutely do not paint from a bottle for skin tones is when I'm painting heads, especially if I'm painting, trying to replicate something that exists in real life, specifically a likeness of an actor. So like when I did my Dukes of Hazzard customs, when I did my Sicario customs, I'm working on a Tom Cruise from Mission Impossible. I'm going to be doing a Charles Bronson from the movie The Mechanic, which is a favorite of mine. I will not be painting from the bottle. I will get several pictures. I remember saying that Google Image is your friend. I will get several pictures of that particular actor and have those up and try and emulate the skin tones as best I can. All right, so we got his arms. So what we need to do now is get that neck, and I'm gonna pop off his head. You can either put the neck back on the figure, or since it pops off easily, get your hemostats in there, run your finger up in the middle to keep it open, and then just paint it off of that. Make sure to keep the paint's already starting to dry out, so on the little palette that I've got, so mix it with a little water to thin it out. Remember, otherwise it gets too thick. And then we're just doing light, thin coats. It's the advantage to doing this is you're not going to get flesh tone on the clothing, which is definitely a hazard of painting skin tone this late in the game. So, oh, sorry. Uh-oh. I dropped it. Shit. I'm gonna pause it while I look for that. Yeah, so spoiler alert, I did eventually find the piece I was missing that I dropped, and a rifle scope, and a sword, and a hand, and all the other pieces that just like seem to disappear into a parallel universe once you drop them onto the floor. But since it's right at 30 minutes, I'm gonna stop it here, and we will pick it up in the next video, part 6, which should be the last installment. So stay tuned. Once again, thank you for watching. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the comments. I do appreciate it. And let's see how our figure looks in the next video.